Welcome back. Now in this video, we're going to begin looking at syllables. Segments are individual speech sounds. We can identify the particular position in the mouth, the particular parts of the mouth involved in pronouncing them, but in fact they don't occur independently in spoken language. We never pronounce segments one at a time. W, I, D, O, N, T, S, P, I, K, th, A, T, way. Rather, speech is produced grouping segments together into syllables. And different languages do this in different ways. There are different restrictions or different patterns for grouping segments into syllables. And so we want to begin looking at that today. We'll look at the segment organization into syllables for English and for Japanese. And then we want to consider how the syllables influence the pronunciation of stress in words in English. And that'll be a topic we cover in a later video. So first, let's remind ourselves that segments can be identified by their segment class based on sonority. Right? So we saw in earlier videos that we can distinguish consonants and vowels. Segments that are produced with a rather open airflow path are the vowels. The consonants can then be further divided into classes of segments that share the degree of sound created during their pronunciation. Right? Remember, the stops are created by completely stopping the airflow through the mouth, which therefore means that they have the lowest degree of sonority. Nasals also stop the airflow through the mouth, but allow the voice to travel through the nose, which then creates a little more sonority. For liquids, we're able to allow the airflow to pass through the mouth, either around the sides of the tongue or along the middle of the tongue. Nevertheless, it's a wider airflow path, which allows the voice to create more sound or greater degrees of sonority. And then the liquids, glides, vowels are increasing from low to high degrees of sonority. So what we want to look at are the sequences of segments that occur in syllables and words. So imagine a sequence p, e, n. Right? So p is a, well, what kind of segment? Well, it's a stop, right? It has the lowest degree of sonority. Whereas a sound like e, which is a vowel, right, has a considerably greater amount of sonority. So the pronunciation pe, right, jumps in sonority from a p, which is very quiet and low in energy, to pe. And the is a nasal, so it has more sonority than the stop, but less sonority than the p. The thing to notice is that pen, which is a one-syllable word, pen has the sonority start low, it rises to the middle, and then falls to the end. There's a rising and falling pattern of sonority. We sometimes call that a peak, a sonority peak, kind of like a mountain peak, P-E-A-K, not P-E-E-K. It has nothing to do with looking through your fingers, but the rise and fall makes a kind of sonority peak. And we see that again and again. So think of a word like lake, right? L-A-K, lake. L is a liquid, so it has more sonority than the stop did, but not as much as the vowel. A is a mid front tense vowel, right? A. Because it's tense, it gets lengthened a bit, right? And there's this tendency to raise the tongue position, but it has greater sonority than L, right? L-A, L-A, lay, and the K is another stop. But notice it's the same pattern of rising to a sonority peak and falling afterwards. Lake, lake. That's a single syllable. In a word like rapid, r-a-p-d. Sorry, no, r-a-p-i-d. Right? The r is a liquid, so kind of in the middle of our sonority ranking. The a is a vowel, a low front vowel with a lot of sonority, because it's a very wide airflow path. And then the p is another stop, which has a very low degree of sonority. I is a vowel. I won't go into the details right away, but it actually has a little bit less sonority than a. It has the same degree of sonority as the glides, like y and w. And that's because the tongue position for y and for I are basically the same. And the degree of opening in the airflow path is approximately the same. And it's considerably less than a sound like a, which is much more open. So it has a greater degree of sonority than p or r, but not quite as high as a. But the final sound d is another stop, and so it also has that lowest degree of sonority. So here you see a word that has two sonority peaks. We rise from r to a, we fall to p, and rise again to I, and fall to d. Two sonority peaks means two syllables. Rapid, rapid, rapid. The word rapid is a two-syllable word. Another five-letter word, or a five-segment word, is the word plant. But in this case, the sequence of syllables still rises to a single peak. Right? P is a stop, L is a liquid, A is a vowel. So we have risen gently from segment to segment, and then we begin to fall to the nasal n, and finally to the stop t. But you can see there's a single sonority peak, and therefore it forms a single syllable. Plant. Plant. And so you'll notice one important characteristic of English syllables is we can have two consonants before the sonority peak, and we can have two consonants after the sonority peak. That's not true in all languages. We'll see a little bit later that that's not true in Japanese. In fact, many languages around the world do not allow two consonants to appear together before the sonority peak the way English does, or two segments, two consonants to appear after the sonority peak within the same syllable as we see in English. Okay. So syllables are patterns of sounds grouped together. So this is clearly part of the study of phonology. Phonetics can also analyze syllables in terms of certain sound properties, but in terms of the patterns of grouping segments into a rising and falling sonority pattern with a peak in the middle of the syllable, that's part of phonology. Right? So we define phonology as the study of sound patterns in language, whereas phonetics is the study of speech sounds in spoken language, or the study of sounds in speech. Now, notice we have sequences of segments like these. There's blurk, snad, nod, sloin, clask. Now, none of these is an English word, right? But some of them seem to be worse than others. If you know English, and you do, you know that there are certain patterns of sounds that are, if not real words, at least possible words. So while there's no word blurk, it's a perfectly reasonable word. You could imagine some new product being released next week, the latest and greatest blurk. It doesn't really sound very enticing, so I'm not sure what that would be, but still, blurk It begins with the bl sound that we have in blank or blood. It includes the irk sound that we have in irk. I think word irk is a word by itself, I suppose. Lurk, to lurk in the darkness. So each of the parts can appear in other words, and together they form a sequence that would be an acceptable word. So it meets the requirements of English phonology. And the same is true for snad. Right? There's no word snad, but there is snag, and there is ad. Right? But that's not true for bnod. Right? Bnod, it's even difficult for me as an English speaker to say, is not a natural pattern in English. We have no words that begin bn. Right? Whereas sloin is possible, clask is possible. Right? So knowledge of English phonology is knowledge that bnod doesn't fit in the group with the others. It doesn't show the same pattern of sounds that we find in English words. Right? We don't have any sequence bn at the beginning of words. We have lots of words that used to have a consonant followed by a nasal, and still we spell them that way, but none of them is pronounced with a consonant followed by a nasal. And that's the restriction. Right? English allows a sequence of consonants at the beginning of a syllable, but it doesn't allow the sequence to have a nasal in the second position. So K-N-O-W is not pronounced kno, but rather no. Now in German, which is closely related to English and shares the same historical origin for a word like no, could easily pronounce kno. Right? They have words with that sequence, but not English. Psychic, right? The PS at the beginning of cyclic is not pronounced. We pronounce it with a S, psychic. But in French, they have the PS sequence. The French word for psychology, psychologie, begins with a ps. So it's a perfectly natural sequence of sounds, just not permitted in English syllables. The W at the beginning of wrong is a historical fact. We don't pronounce wrong, though historically there was a time when there were two segments pronounced together. And likewise the P of pneumonia. Right? We don't pronounce pneumonia. Pneumonia. Although the French word for a tire, like the tire on your car, un pneu, begins with a pn, a P and an N together. So languages will differ in the limits on segment sequences in syllables. Okay. Now, we group segments into syllables, but we group them into syllable parts, which is to say that the syllable can be divided into parts that contain segments. And the four parts I'm going to identify are called the onset, the rhyme, the nucleus, and the coda. The word onset means beginning. In fact, outside of phonetics, we use the word onset to mean the beginning of something. The onset of summer, the onset of illness, right? the start or the beginning of something. Rhyme refers to the rest of the syllable, everything after the onset. So if I have a group of words that rhyme, like mat, pat, cat, fat, that first sound, k, f, right? That's the onset, the beginning. And then the rest of the syllable, the at, is the rhyme. And it's the part that rhymes. And then within the rhyme, there are two smaller elements, the nucleus and the coda. You may have seen these words from other areas of study. The nucleus comes from biology, right? The nucleus of a cell. You can't have a cell without a nucleus. The nucleus has to be part of a cell. Well, you can't have a syllable without the nucleus segment. And if there is a nucleus, there has to be a syllable. And finally, the coda is kind of the end or the final part. In music, the coda would be the ending, the final section. So in a word like fun, which is made up of 3 segments, f, n, right? The first segment, f, you'll remember, maybe, from last week, is a fricative. And a fricative it's not a stop, but it has a little bit of airflow through a very narrow opening between the lower lip and the upper teeth. F, f. Is a vowel, so it has the greatest degree of sonority. F, n. N is a nasal, so it has less sonority than the vowel, but more sonority than the fricative. But you can see there's rising and falling sonority. It forms a sonority peak. The sonority peak is the nucleus of a syllable. So anytime I have a sequence of segments, a segment that forms the peak in sonority across that sequence of segments will be the nucleus of the syllable. And the universal structure of syllables tells me that the nucleus is going to be, I'm jumping ahead of myself. Right? Let me identify each of the constituent parts first. So the nucleus is the sonority peak. Any segment before the nucleus is going to be the onset. Now, so I'm just using the letter O to represent onset and the letter N to represent nucleus, just for reasons of space. And then the segment after the nucleus is the coda. Now, in English, the nucleus and the coda form the rhyme together. So in my earlier examples of cat, mat, fat, sat, right? The s, k, f onset comes before the rhyme, and then the rhyme is further divided into the nucleus and the coda. So the syllable itself is actually joining an onset and a rhyme. That's the basic syllable structure of English. Identify the sonority peak in a sequence of segments. That sonority peak forms the nucleus of the syllable. The nucleus is in the rhyme of the syllable. Any segment before the rhyme of the syllable is the onset. And any remaining segment after the nucleus joins the nucleus in the rhyme of the syllable. Okay? Now, take a Japanese example. Okay? So, hong it has 3 segments. H, o, m. Okay? Again, there's rising sonority from the h, which has the lowest. O has the highest. M has less. So the O is a sonority peak. It forms the nucleus. The h comes before the nucleus of the syllable, so it's the onset. And then the comes after the sonority peak, so it's the coda. And here's where the syllables of English and the syllables of Japanese are different. In English, the rhyme groups together the nucleus and the coda. In Japanese syllables, the rhyme groups together the onset and the nucleus. Okay? The ho goes closer together than the So English, it's f, un. But in Japanese, it's ho, hong. Okay? And then the rhyme forms a syllable with the coda. So a fundamental difference in the phonologies of English and Japanese is in the rules for grouping segments together into syllables. Another difference is that Japanese doesn't allow more than one segment, more than one consonant, before the nucleus of a syllable, the way English does. But let's look at an example of that. So take the English word plant. Right? So there's a sequence of 5 segments, p, l, a, n, t. Right? The a is a sonority peak, so it forms the nucleus of the syllable. The segment before it is the onset, l, And because English allows two consonants before the nucleus, the p is actually part of the onset as well. They form an onset cluster, pl, pl. It sounds like we're pronouncing the P first and the L second. In fact, we're pronouncing them together, pl, pl. The P is a much shorter sound, and at the moment that my lips are together to produce the P, my tongue is already in position for the ul. So as the lips open, p, pl, the L can be heard, right? Pl, pl. So there's a branching onset. It branches into two segments. And that's permitted in English syllables, but not in all languages. Okay? After the nucleus, we have a coda, n, and English allows two consonants to branch in the coda as well. Now, it's an English syllable, so the nucleus and the coda form a rhyme, and the rhyme and the onset are joined together in the syllable. So we have pl, ant, plant. And when children learn to read in English-speaking countries, this is actually an important step in the development of their reading ability, is to break words apart into onset, pl, and rhyme, ant. Pl, ant. And then we do lots of exercises like pl, ant, pl, and then some other word, I, ply. But the same sequence of segments will produce a different kind of syllable structure for Japanese. Right? What would happen if I wanted to produce the same 5 segments in following the rules of Japanese syllable phonology? Well, there's a syllable peak, right? There's still a p, l, a, n, t. The a is a sonority peak. The segment before the sonority peak is an onset, so it would be a l or a d is close to it. But you cannot have a branching onset in Japanese syllables. So the branching pl is not possible. But the n that comes after can be part of the coda, right? That's all fine. But you can't have a branching coda. So you can't have the nt that we get in English. Right? It's a Japanese syllable, so the onset and the rhyme can join together to produce ra, or more likely ra, right? Da, which is part of a syllable with the following coda n. Right? Rang. Rang is a perfectly fine syllable in Japanese. Rang. Right? In order for the p to be pronounced, however, it needs to have a nucleus. Right? You can't have an onset in a syllable without a nucleus. Every syllable must have a nucleus, and without a nucleus, there can be no syllable. And the same is true for the t. The t can't be part of a coda, can't be part of an onset, unless there's a nucleus. Right? So what happens is the p forms an onset, and the t also forms an onset. But an onset of what? Well, an onset of a syllable with a following empty vowel. We add the vowel. So in order to pronounce the p, it gets pronounced p. In order to pronounce the t, it gets pronounced o, to. Now, there's another reason for that, which we're not going into, but if we were to insert the vowel u after the t, it would actually change the t to a ts, right? You have ts. There's no tso. Sorry, there's no tu in Japanese. T becomes ts. Right? But in order to keep the t sound, the o gets inserted, which is exactly the pronunciation of a word like pranto. Right? So pranto has the same segments as plant. What's different is the syllables and the rules for grouping segments into syllables in the two languages. Right? Okay. So, just to summarize, we've seen that syllables are made up of parts. There's an onset, which is the starting consonant or consonant cluster, depending on the language. There's the nucleus, which is the essential element of the syllable. Every syllable must have a nucleus, and every nucleus must be in a syllable. And it's the segment that forms a sonority peak in a sequence of segments. Any segment that comes after that sonority peak can then close the syllable as part of the coda. And together, either the rhyme and the coda together, either the nucleus and the coda together form a rhyme in English, or the onset and the nucleus form a rhyme together, as in Japanese. The rules of syllable structures for different languages can differ in this way. And we've also seen that another way in which they differ is whether a single constituent, these are 4 constituents or parts, right? If a single syllable part or syllable constituent can contain more than one syllable, more than one segment. Right? English allows branching constituents. English allows 2 consonants to appear in a branching onset, or 2 consonants in a branching coda, or 2 vowels in a branching nucleus. We didn't talk in detail about the diphthongs I, oi, and ow, but those are effectively vowels pronounced together in a branching nucleus. But we'll come back to those at a later time if we have time. Okay, let me stop there. That's our introduction to syllables. Now, English has stressed syllables and unstressed syllables in words. So in the next video, we'll begin looking at the role of syllable structure for determining stress in English. See you there.